Good evening. Welcome to Chicago First. My name is Sister Catherine Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of Maryville Academy, and we are delighted this collaboration with Chicago Access Network Television and Maryville presenting Children First for us this evening. I am delighted that our guest this evening is Richard Calica, the Director of the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. So welcome, Director.
Thank you.
We appreciate your coming for the program this evening.
My pleasure.
And I am also personally delighted. I have known the director for many years, and I'd like to invite him to tell us a little bit about his background, which is quite impressive. So please, could you tell us how you got into the field of social work and
Sure.
what you've been doing before you came to the department?
Well, I began as a child welfare worker in Los Angeles about a year after the Watts riots, and I was a protective service worker there for about 2.5 years. And then my wife and I moved to Chicago to pursue our graduate education. So I went to the University of Chicago, studied there, and then studied after that for 2 years at Michael Reese Hospital Department of Psychiatry, where I did a postgraduate clinical internship in social work. And after that, I worked at the Illinois Department of Mental Health for 2.5 years, running 2 inpatient units, and then became the executive director of the Juvenile Protective Association of Chicago, which is a private agency that deals with families where children were abused and neglected.
And when did you begin with the Juvenile Protective Association?
1978. I was 32 years old.
All right.
Yeah.
And you are also a licensed therapist?
Yes, I am. I was in private practice from 1975 to 2005, seeing clients, and I still supervise folks who do that.
And so I had the pleasure of meeting the director when he became the director of the Juvenile Protective Association. And would you like to say a little bit more about what the agency did?
Sure. It's a small private agency that was founded in 1901 by Jane Addams and her friends. We were the first probation officers of the first juvenile court in the United States. And the agency really primarily did in-home protective services with families where children were abused and neglected, but where it was felt that the family could still be kept together. And we were doing that for decades before the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services even came into being. When I became director, I kind of expanded the program to include research, consultation, and training. And so we got involved in a 20-year federal longitudinal study following children for 20 years to take a look at the long-term effects of child maltreatment, did training of DCFS workers, judges, state's attorneys, and a lot of publishing and consulting around the country and actually around the world.
And I'd like to tell our viewers a little personal story from the time I knew you, Director, when you were Director of Juvenile Protective Association. There was a time when I had the opportunity to work in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office with Chicago police officers who were finding children being used in street exploitation, sexual exploitation of them in child pornography, and also being used with different pimps. And I'm telling this background because I want the viewers to know that as we worked with the children, we found that their families needed some help to bring them back home again after this life on the streets. And so we turned to Richard Calica, then Executive Director of the Juvenile Protective Association, and I will ask him to speak about it, but let me just add this introductory idea. I went to him and said, "We don't have any money. Can you help our families anyway?" And he said yes, and...
Well, it was interesting. At that point, the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services didn't believe that they were responsible for those families because the perpetrators of the sexual crimes on the children weren't relatives. And so it was felt if you weren't a relative, then it really was a crime and not a family matter. But these children came from families very much like the ones that we serve. And so I was fortunate enough to be the director of an agency that primarily was funded with private dollars. And so I didn't have to worry about who was going to pay for it or whether they were in my catchment area or whether I had a contract for it. And I got 4 of my friends in other large agencies, and we put together a consortium of workers around the county and served about 45 families where the police would come and the undercover police were using the pictures, the pornographic pictures, to find the kids in Uptown. And then when they would identify the kids, we were able to get to their families. And so it was really a very exciting project. And we put away a lot of folks who were hurting kids during that time. It was fun.
And so all of this is the history of the man whom the governor last year named as the director of the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. When did you begin this work?
December 15th of 2011.
And Director, can you talk to us about the mission of DCFS?
Sure. DCFS is responsible to take care of the problem of parents who have gone so beyond the pale in terms of caring for their children that they violated anything that anybody would reasonably consider to be good parenting. So I'm not talking about parents who sometimes lose control and smack their kids. Not that I'm advocating beating. I'm talking about parents that do things that, regardless of what race, creed, or socioeconomic level you come from, you could agree is not good parenting. You don't burn your children. You don't break their legs. You don't sexually molest them. You don't leave them alone when they're very young so that they can fend for themselves. And our job is to investigate complaints of children being neglected or abused, to decide relatively quickly within the first 45 minutes, can I leave this child in this environment or do I have to take custody of this child? And then to work with those children and parents to try to make things safe for the kids so that they can either return home if we take them, stay home if we think we can keep them safe while they're at home, or if we can't return them home, ultimately to find permanent, stable places where they can be loved and raised by people who will act as their parents.
And how many children are we talking about?
We have about 15,300 children in our care right now, and about 5,900 of those children are 5 years of age and younger.
Really?
Yeah.
And why such young children?
Well, the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services takes away fewer children than any state in the union. And so we're taking away the kids that are most seriously in need of protection. The children who are most likely to have the most serious outcomes from child abuse and neglect are those children who are 5 and under. Those are the children that land up dead. And so our triage is to go after very young kids. Most of the time, adolescents who are being hurt, and while it's not ideal, can run, can defend themselves. And so the largest intake is on that level. And then since we take away fewer kids, they tend to be kids who are much more problematic than the ones we were taking away 20 years ago. And by that I mean they are have more physical illnesses, they are more developmentally delayed, they are have more mental illness problems, they have more educational problems, and so these kids come to us with a host of difficulties that are consequent to their having been neglected and abused.
So we'll come in a moment then to what you do to help care for the children, but can you tell our viewers first, someone makes a report to the Department of Children and Family Services and says, I think a child's being mistreated. Can you talk a little bit about what happens next?
Sure. We at that point, that call comes into our hotline and it gets sent to the local area office where we have protective service investigators. A protective service investigator will go out to the home and try to determine whether there's reason to believe that the child is unsafe based on the complaint that was made. We also check out other kinds of issues besides that complaint. We try to talk with families and not treat them as perpetrators, but I think that there's a common interest among the department and parents that children be safe. So we will talk with the parents, we will talk with the children if they're verbal. We will do background checks on everybody in the house to find out if they have criminal records or previous complaints of child abuse and neglect. And to the extent that we find something that concerns us, we'll start to broaden the net of people that we speak with to find out what else has been going on in the house. We will check with the police to find out if there have been domestic violence calls. We will talk with other relatives, teachers, and so on. But clearly, if we come upon a situation where the child is in distress and clearly in danger, we and the police have the right to take custody of that child, and so we will take custody of that child at that point.
And if that happens, where does that child go?
Well, depending on what time of the day or night it could come to some place like Maryville. It could come to an emergency shelter, or we could. We usually try to find an interested, concerned, and safe relative that is willing to take custody of the child, and we will talk with the parent about that. So if there's a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt around that is not a known felon and is not known to the Department to Abuse and Neglect Kids, we will leave the child in the care of family members, which is the ideal, until we can sort things out and figure out what's going on and how can we work with the family and the child to take care of those conditions that made it unsafe for the child to be in the home.
And of course, if you take custody of a child, you must, your staff must be in court within 72 hours.
72 hours, yes, and we have to establish to the court's satisfaction that there was urgent and immediate necessity to take the child away, and that means that we had facts that would lead any reasonable human being to believe that the child was in imminent danger of being seriously harmed. And so my workers have to prove that in front of a judge and a state's attorney and a public defender. And so there's a good set of checks and balances to make sure it's not just one person making a judgment about a child being unsafe.
And I know that there can be different outcomes of the cases. Sometimes it will be the decision that when your staff are working with the families that the child can return home safely.
Mm-hmm.
And what would you be looking for that would result in that?
Well, we look for a parent and parents actually to be able to help identify what the underlying conditions and contributing factors were to make the child unsafe, and to acknowledge, not in terms of admitting guilt, but to acknowledge that they were less than adequate in terms of providing for the child's protection, and to try to figure out ways in which they might be able to do that differently. And depending on the parent, that could be a simple problem or a very difficult problem. When I say difficult, most of the time it isn't just a matter of lack of knowledge. Parenting classes sound like a quick fix, but most of us, without having gone and gotten a PhD, know how to take care of a kid. I mean, mothers knew how to do it in the 13th century. Most of us know that you shouldn't leave a 2-month-old in the bathtub alone. Most of us know that if you drop your kid on their head, that it won't feel good and that it'll hurt the kid. So what's going on with many of our parents is that they themselves have been deprived, and they don't have good models about how to take care of their kids. And so we will work with them to try to figure out if they can get to the point where they could recognize and take care of the child's needs as well as their own needs. In other cases, it may have been a simple accident, or it could have been a simple oversight, and it's not a big time problem, and then that makes it a lot easier. And with family support and community support, it's possible to return those kids quite quickly. And we look to do that as quickly as possible, because the state is a second best parent to the family, and when at all possible, we like to return children to their families as quickly as possible.
And what impact are you seeing when families have substance abuse issues?
Well, unfortunately, when somebody is addicted to drugs, they're much more concerned about their own psychological state, and they're much more concerned about meeting their own needs than they are the needs of their kids, and their reality testing sometimes goes out the window. And so the folks who are really involved with drugs are not very good caretakers, and they're usually not smart enough to let their kids be taken care of by relatives. And most recently, we've been seeing a huge problem where people who are using drugs are taking their babies into bed and waking up the next morning and finding out that they rolled over on their babies and killed them. And it's not at all uncommon for me to get 3 or 4 of those a week on my BlackBerry.
Really?
Yeah, it's scary. All over the state. Unfortunately, that's what I get on my BlackBerry. Every child that dies comes to our attention, and we have to investigate to find out if the other children in the family are safe. So the police report those deaths to us. So drugs are not good for kids or for adults.
I guess. Now, you also mentioned mental illness, and I do want to just share with our viewers, we have one article that was recently done by the Chicago Tribune about a playground therapy, a sanctuary that Maryville was blessed to be able to build with some donors' help, and this is for our children at one of our programs. These young ladies who have experienced some serious mental health issues because of the abuse and neglect that they suffered are able to take advantage of this sanctuary in order to be able to help deal with that. But that's really talking about one tool. You really understand the bigger picture of mental health or mental illness. Can you talk with our viewers about it?
The real problem with child abuse and neglect, while you read in the paper about the real horrors, is that when children are abused and neglected, they have to figure out why am I being treated this way? And what's so bad about me that my mother and my father don't like me enough to feed me in the morning, to take care of me? Why am I being beaten all the time? And over a long period of time, this really has a profound effect on the kid's capacity to function. And when you talk about mental illness, that's what drives kids over the edge. And then they spend the rest of their lives trying to figure out not only what was so wrong with me, but how can I fix this so that somebody would love me? And unfortunately, since they don't have a model in their own minds about being able to relate to people who will treat them well, they compulsively seek out people who treat them the same way their parents did, and they keep trying to fix it, and it never works. And as I mentioned before, since we take away fewer of these kids, and these kids have really been exposed over long periods of time to abusive and neglectful behaviors, these kids have a lot of problems, and their problems have to do with being able to trust people, to have a confident expectation that their needs will be met and that adults actually care about them enough to protect them and love them. And so those of us who try to take them in and care for them, like Maryville and stuff, and other folks, find out that despite their best efforts, it takes a very long time to get these children to respond, because they don't trust anybody, and why should they? And so, particularly in foster homes, that becomes very difficult. If I've decided that I want to open up my home to love a child and take them in, and I bring this child in and I treat them as well as my own, and I do everything I can think of, and I get no response back that's positive, and no matter what I try, the kid still treats me like I can't be trusted and I can't be loved, that becomes very frustrating for normal folks. And they say, take them back. Send them somewhere else. I mean, places like Maryville that use professionals don't have that problem, but regular folks do. And so these kids have and then they get bounced from place to place, and it just proves to them again and again, I'm unlovable, nobody wants to take care of me, and it becomes a very bad cycle.
And what do you do about it?
Well, I think first of all, what we try to do is to work with agencies to make it clear that stability of caretaking is the most important thing in the world. So I just sent out a letter actually to all of our providers to let them know that there were three things I was concerned about in their care of our children. One was the stability of the place they were in. Secondly was the stability of the social workers that were taking care of them. And third was the length of time they had them in their care. And that's all I'm going to look at. And so we try to focus in on those issues, and then hopefully help the care providers as well as using therapists to help kids deal with it. But frankly, I was a practicing psychotherapist. The person who takes care of the child 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, is the one in the best position to help that child feel as if they're being loved. And so we are looking to provide anticipatory guidance and support to caretakers to help them understand how to struggle with the problem that the kid is struggling with, and to give the kid the kind of environment that will help them overcome those difficulties that I talked about.
Now, you've been at the department not even a year yet.
Yeah.
But of course, this has been your profession. You have been working with children and families for these many years.
Mm-hmm.
So, when you came to the department, what was one of your I won't say surprises, because you came in knowing the stories of our children, but what are some of the biggest difficulties that you need to face at this point?
Well, I think in a large organizations sometimes do things for their own convenience rather than the convenience of their client or customer. And by that I mean, well, I'll give you an example. If you call your auto dealer and you speak to a salesman and you have a question about a part, the salesman will say, that's not my problem, go talk to parts. But we're dealing with live human beings, and the biggest problem that I found at the Department of Children and Family Services was that it was structured to help children and families, but it had a million different silos, and the right hand didn't necessarily know what the left hand was doing, and we had a specialty for everything. So if you're sexually abused, I got a specialty for that. If you're physically abused, I got a specialty for that. And instead of seeing that it's all one person and one family and one set of problems. It was like, you've got a symptom, I've got a cure. You've got 5 symptoms, I've got 5 cures. And so what I've done and what we're working on right now is centralizing all services that have direct contact with live human beings and trying to minimize the number of people that a client has to speak with in order to be able to get help and to continue to get help, and to take everything else in the department and to help everybody else in the department realize that their job is to support the worker getting good outcomes with children and families. So the job of an attorney, the job of a clinical specialist, the job of somebody who finds adoptive homes, that all those are support services, but support of the direct line worker. And I guess the other big problem I found, and this is not unusual, is that as a result of tragedies that have occurred, there have been layers built up in the department. When something goes wrong, instead of trying to fix what went wrong, the department hired somebody else to watch the person who did something wrong. And so it became a situation where there was a million people watching what was going on, and nobody had the responsibility and the authority to make decisions. And so I'm thinning that out again and putting it all in the hands of the supervisor and the worker. They don't need anybody else to tell them what to do. And, if they need a consult, fine, they can call for it. But I have to figure, if you've been doing this work for 6 months or a year, you should be able to figure out how to do an investigation, and with some consultation for your supervisor, figure out how to do that. So I think those are the two major things, and I'm hoping by slimming it out that it'll provide enough continuity for our clients to be able to work over a continuous period of time with people and get better, because that's what gets people better.
And one more challenge,
Yeah.
I think that I've seen in the news, you've experienced some serious budget cuts.
Well, that's true. When the governor introduced his budget, we were cut $42 million, and I was able to figure out, with some combination of primarily canceling some contracts of things that I thought were less than central to the mission of the Department of Children and Family Services, that I could make it. The legislature added another $45 million cut onto that and decided to do it line item. When the governor took money away, obviously the state is in big trouble. If you've read the newspaper, we're in worse shape than most states in the country. He needed to come up with some savings. He didn't say, take it out of here, take it out of there. He says, I hired you to be the professional of this department. You figure out how to run it. The legislature started to do line item cuts, and so they took $27 million out of personnel. I was going to repurpose those personnel to put them on the front line to do protective services. Now they're taking away $27 million, so that's really kind of drastic, and I've had to cut $50 million worth of community contracts. Now, unlike what some legislators are saying, I do not have the power to move that money around. When money is taken out of a line item called personnel, I cannot say, well, instead of taking it out of personnel, I won't buy a computer this year, or we won't buy cars, or we won't buy phones. I don't have the freedom to move it around. It's illegal. So it's a real crunch right now, unfortunately. And I'm hoping that by cutting non-essential services, that I can continue the mission of DCFS, but non-essential services will mean that more kids will be taken away, because if I can't provide supports for families intact, then protective services workers will say, well, the only way to keep this kid safe is to put him in foster care because I don't have any supports for his family in the community, and we may see a movement towards our foster care population going up.
Well, that is a pretty serious situation to be in. Can you give us a final message for our viewers, something of hope, or something to aspire to, or something we should do to help with this situation?
Well, I think that that's an interesting question. I think there is hope that human beings have a fantastic capacity for resilience. What I'm hoping is that the legislature, in their infinite wisdom, will figure out how to shift some money around to restore some of the cuts, because I think it's essential for us to provide services for intact families, to keep them in their own homes rather than put them in substitute care.
Thank you. And thank you to all our viewers. We're very grateful that Director Richard Calica made time from his busy schedule to be with us this evening. Thank you and good evening.